Welcome back to the show, everyone. Of course, we are inspired by our next guest because prolific would be an understatement for him. Not only is he a very busy doctor in the ER here in Vancouver, but he's just written and published his 7th novel.
7. The newest one is called The Far Side of the Sky, and we're joined now by Dr. Daniel Kalla. How are you?
Great. Daniel, how are you?
Great to be
I
back.
can't believe
Thanks,
this is 7 books. Can you believe it?
Oh, I can't believe
Where
it.
do you, honestly, where do you get the time? I mean, when do you actually write? Do you have a favorite time? Do you set aside time?
Yeah, you know, being an emerge doc, I work shift work, so I got a bunch of weekdays off, and sometimes patients have to wait a little longer.
Right, right.
So I don't write at work. I want to be very clear.
If you look like you're making notes on a chart,
Yeah.
really, you're just breaking down plot points.
No, but yeah, it's, you know, that's in every emergency room. I think we've talked about this, but you scratch the surface, and there's so many people with other careers or other interests and pursuits because we work hard, but we work intense, sometimes short hours, and often weekends, and we often get our weekdays off to pursue our dreams.
Now, this is an amazing book. We've talked to you about it a couple of times before because there was a lot of research, travel, and background stuff that went into us. Tell us about The Far Side of the Sky and where you take your readers.
Yeah, well, it's a historical novel set in Shanghai in World War II, and it tells this amazing story that I first heard about 4 years ago. I mean, I grew up, my family's Jewish, but I'd never heard this story of the Shanghai Jews and the fact that Shanghai actually somewhat inadvertently ended up protecting 20 or 30,000 German Jews who escaped, who were able to escape to Shanghai when they had nowhere else to go.
And the book starts at one of the worst and darkest moments for humanity, period, Kristallnacht in Germany, which was innocently enough night of shattered glass. And then really the rest of the world didn't want Jewish citizens from Germany.
No, they were all afraid of the domino effect, that if they took
once
some,
you open the door,
tens of thousands were. So yeah, it really was. They had this big Evian conference in 1937 when Roosevelt tried to arrange, and the only country that would accept these refugees was like the Dominican Republic. It was a bizarre phenomenon. In Canada, one of the diplomats had a famous quote that one is too many, and it wasn't the most shining hour in terms.
And
of
why Shanghai? How did that happen?
Well, because Shanghai was such an amazing city. First of all, it was always a treaty city. It was largely created by the British after the Opium Wars in the 1840s, which is an amazing story in of itself. But it had a British autonomous zone, it had a French autonomous zone, it had a Chinese autonomous zone. And by the late 1930s, the Japanese had overtaken the Chinese area, but the British and French were still there. So there's this Chinese city that is not ruled by Chinese and is so non-Chinese that it has its own Chinatown. So,
even the invaders aren't invading the part that is...
And no one was interested in passport control, right? The British didn't, no one wanted to take responsibility. So passively, it became this city that you could get to if you had a ticket on a cruise liners, as most of these Jews got there from Italy or Germany. So they'd go from these, they'd spend everything, because the Nazis didn't let them take any money if they let them out.
You have a whole section where the main characters are escaping out of Nazi Germany, and literally every single thing that they own is being confiscated or searched, and the attempt to leave them penniless as they leave the country.
That's what they wanted, to take every possession.
So when people got to Shanghai, I mean, your central character is a doctor, his family's in medicine, but I mean, the case would have been, at least for the Jewish refugees, penniless when they arrived there.
It was literally, they'd step off these like 5-star cruise liners where they were weighted on hand and foot and walked onto the dock with just what they were carrying. And it was bizarre because these were middle-class, secular people who were assimilated. They weren't used to it. But they did get some support. And bizarrely, there was already a Jewish community in Shanghai, a rich British one that had been there for 100 years. So they did offer some support, and they set up hostels. And some of the refugees had enough or could do enough to get their own places and were pretty industrious. And in fact, within a couple of years, sorry, Fiona, they set up an area of the city that became known as Little Vienna, because it was, the bakeries,
the Austrians.
Yeah, the newspapers, the theaters. They looked like, people would walk down there and think they were in Vienna.
What was it like for you delving into this part of history? Because it is a part of history that, I mean, until we first spoke to you about it, I wasn't really aware of it either. What was it like for you finding out all of this stuff?
Well, it was interesting. It was very mixed emotions for me, because my family, my parents were, Holocaust escapees, not so much survivors. They were lucky their families got out of Europe, or got out of Nazi-controlled Europe just in time. and my dad survived in Hungary, but never faced a concentration camp and stuff. But I didn't know about this particular, and what I love about this story is that it's an upbeat story. You know, you hear so many tragedies about what happened, but these were people who largely survived. Granted, it wasn't easy, and you know, there's some pretty suspenseful moments, I hope, in the book where their lives literally, I mean, the Nazis didn't forget about these Jews. Like 3 years later,
and it's amazing that they did survive.
I know,
and
but can you
fight,
imagine they're fighting a war on two fronts. They're pretty busy in their own right, and they worry about, they send the highest ranking SS officer in Asia over to try to convince the Japanese to exterminate these Jews.
Well, and for the characters in this, and historically, there is an element of jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire in Japanese-controlled Shanghai at one point, because of course they were allied with Nazi Germany. So.
Yeah, but the Japanese had this bizarre thing that was kind of what's called positive anti-Semitism. They didn't know any Jews. There were no Jews.
Positive anti-Semitism.
Well, because there were all these, there's all this sort of propaganda saying Jews controlled the banks, Jews controlled the governments, Jews had all the money, and the Nazis or the Japanese kind of interpreted that. Well, that means Jews are important and should be respected, right? If they're this, and so it was this bizarre phenomenon. Right. So in a way, the Japanese treated the Jews of Shanghai fairly well.
Wow. Now, I always ask you what's next, and I did right before we did the interview, and I was surprised to hear that you're going to continue this story. Yeah. Tell us what is next for you.
Yeah, no, I was going to continue. I do have my talk show killer idea going, but after that...
Talk show killer idea, huh?
But
perfect.
I'm going to go back...
sitting innocently, and all of a sudden...
I'm going back to the thriller genre after I read it, but I'm writing right now the sequel to this book, because this ends, it was too much story to tell the entire World War II, so it ends in 1942. And the last 3 years of the war were amazing there in Shanghai, because they set up a ghetto for the Jews, and there was a whole other series of challenges and stuff. So there was, you know, and I do want to emphasize, sorry, it's not just about the Jews. Everybody was there. There were communists. There was more opium dens, more brothels. There were fascists. Like the whole, it was like a microcosm of war, what Shanghai was. And I just, you know, I think it was the most fascinating city of the 20th
Well, and you
century.
explore it in the love connections throughout this book, but also became, you know, another instance of that melting pot. When cultures live together, sometimes it does lead to, you know, all these things happening that sort of forward civilization in the world.
No, it's so true. The heroine in my story is, you know, she's Eurasian, right? And there were tons of Eurasians, because there were all these Westerners living beside the Chinese, and you know, and she feels like this outsider in her own community, because no Eurasian is born into their community, right? And so it was this, you know, there was that whole aspect of the story to explore. So
it's a beautiful
I got a lot more to write.
It really is. Pick up The Far Side of the Sky. And we actually have a copy to give away. You can email us for your chance to win at urbanrush@shaw.ca. And Dr. Daniel Kalla will be appearing at the Vancouver Writers Festival, and his talk will be at the Vancouver Public Library on Wednesday, September the 28th. You can go to the website for all the te's. Thank you so much.
Thanks Daniel. Appreciate it. Always a pleasure.
Talk show killer, huh?
Yeah. And,
which one?
He's
not telling.
Talk about what